conversation if you don't want to talk about it anymore. Now, so I do want to introduce Dr. Brandeis Marshall, who is an education activist, a scholar, and a data justice advocate. Originally trained as a computer scientist, her work sits at the intersection of data, AI ethics, data engineering, and culturally responsive pedagogy. Brandeis regularly instructs, mentors, speaks, and studies the racial, gender, and socioeconomic impacts of data and technology. She worked as a technical advisor to the Deepfakes Accountability Act, introduced to the U.S. House of Representatives, and Brandeis is a faculty at Spelman College and also a faculty associate at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard Law School. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Brandeis Marshall.
Yay, thank you so much. Thank you so much. I want to kind of start everything off by just explaining a little bit about my name, because if you know anything about linguistics, my name is kind of unique, my first name. So my first name is Brandeis, and my last name is Marshall. So I like to introduce myself by saying, look, I'm two US Supreme Court justices, like all packed into a small Black woman. And that is Louis D. Brandeis, who was the first Jewish Supreme Court Justice of the United States, and Thurgood Marshall, who was the first Black Supreme Court Justice in the United States. So I'm all those things kind of wrapped into one. But Brandeis is actually of Czech Jewish descent, and it means man on a burnt hill. And so ironically, most times people think I'm a man unless they know who I am. And they also think that I'm Jewish, and they also think that I'm 6 foot tall, and none of those things are true. So I find it pretty funny. And the reason why I go through a little bit of that linguistics is because we're going to be talking about how language is done online and how automation and language intersect and don't intersect. So let me hop into the slides. And of course, I've been teaching a long time. I've been doing a lot of speaking, especially in this COVID land. So if you have questions, if you could hold off to the end, that way I can make sure that I at least get through all of the slides, and I might answer the question that you might have. And then of course I can go back to the slides when you ask your questions. And feel free to share your questions via the chat. And if you feel comfortable enough, go ahead and holler by unmuting, and then I can answer the questions as well at the end. All right, so let me just go ahead and hop in. So this topic is one which I love talking about, but also is sometimes emotionally troubling to talk about, because there's a lot of things happening, a lot of murders happening to Black and brown bodies, to Black and brown people, to people in the trans community. And one of the ways in which I, as a computer scientist by training, am working to bring more light to the issues within these vulnerable communities is through my scholarship. And one of them happens to be Activism, in which I will go through a little bit about kind of the realm of what's happening inside of the online space and activism space. And so I always want to start off with Black Twitter, because this is where I find a particular home in explaining the prevalence of hashtags and their usefulness into spur activism and to bring people together in order to amplify certain ideas, certain approaches, and also to, unfortunately, immortalize certain individuals who have been shot or killed or harmed by our structural racism systems. So when it comes to Black Twitter, little introduction, people typically think of Black Twitter, when they say Black Twitter, they wind up thinking of Black Lives Matter. And most people don't know, Black Twitter started way before that. It started by documentation around 2018, right around when Twitter actually started, because Twitter started about 2006, 2007. that there was a lot of conversation late at night among people of color, mainly Black people, on this platform, and it winds up getting noticed by the people listed here on the screen, Antil Dash and of course Chris Wilson in 2008, 2009, respectively. And they started to coin this term of Black Twitter, which is really a subculture or sub-community within the Twitter space. And Black Twitter is so important because it not only talks through individuals who happen to be celebrities, individuals who happen to have certain activism type of leanings, but it also is a way for people of the same thought process to kind of commune together online in a very open way. And the way that I like to think through Black Twitter is it's the first time that Black people have had the opportunity to document their history in real time on a public platform. Every time else, it has been in academic spaces or has been locally done. But Twitter allows lots of people in order to see the same information and be able to respond. But let me get to the data because I am definitely a data head. So according to Pew Research, there is a year in and year out evaluation of how many people are on Twitter, and then of the people that are on Twitter, what is the demographic population? And so interestingly enough, when it comes to Twitter, about a quarter of those on Twitter happen to identify as Black, and then which happens to be the biggest margin. They also look at other demographics and other social media platforms, but I'm focusing on Twitter. I'm not doing Snapchat or Facebook or one of all the other ones, just on Twitter. And what is so interesting about Twitter, at least for Black people, is the fact that Black people tend to use this platform a lot more prevalently. This is, of course, before TikTok kind of got into this game, but we'll see what happens in 2021 reporting if TikTok happens to have a lot more demographics of Black people. But also when it comes to Hispanic individuals, they happen to be very much on Twitter as well. Not so much when it comes to white or white-leaning individuals. And interestingly, they actually don't do a whole lot of demographics on the Asian American and Pacific Islander population as part of Pew Research. So I just want to make sure all this is noted because there are definitely gaps in the data, which is where I always sit when it comes to data justice, is where are the gaps and why are the gaps there? So when it comes to the language within the subculture of Black Twitter, there are definitely some hallmarks. And so I've referenced some work here. And if you want to know those works, I can, of course, share those after this talk. Some of them are in the early 2010s, some of them even earlier than that. But essentially, there is two main components of Black Twitter when it comes to the tweets. There is Black tags, which are Black hashtags. They tend to be very racialized in their context. And some examples are here on the screen, like solidarity is for white women, or if they gun me down, that was popular a few years ago. And then of course, most recently, I can't breathe. And of course, Black Lives Matter. And then there's also other types of Black tags that exude joy and appreciation for Black people or Black culture, like Black Girl Joy, Black Girl Magic, Black Boy Joy, and so many others. The second type of linguistic signature when it comes to Black Twitter tweets happens to be what's called signifying. And these happen to be this blend of irony and sarcasm that tends to be within the tweets. So as an example, yo mama jokes, and one is on the screen. There are many others. We're not going to go down a whole number of yo mama jokes because we'll be here all day because there's a whole lot of yo mama jokes, but that's just one type of satire and irony that tends to be part of Black Twitter tweets. And please know that Black Twitter doesn't just include Black people. It tends to include more than Black people, but one of the hallmarks happens to be a Black person tweeting in particular about Black culture. So this whole preamble is in order to get to how do we document hashtags and social movements that are born out of hashtags. And so there was some work that I did with some former students a few years ago that I wanted to talk through, just to give kind of an overview of it. Um, and then we're going to move on to sentiment analysis, which I find really fascinating, is what I'm working on now. So when it comes to social movements, we have a number of social movements that have gone on over the past few years. There definitely is Black Lives Matter. There is other ones when it comes to policing as of late. But a few years ago, one of the main hashtags was about the Oscars. Oscars just happened this past weekend. We can talk about that a little bit later too, if you want. A little disappointed in the Oscars, but whatever. Um, but the conversation around the Oscars was about the nomination of actors of color, and particularly Black actors, and of course their movies, and of course the background roles, right? The backstage roles of director, of a makeup, of costumes, everything. So why is it that Black actors and actresses are not nominated? And this bubbled up early in the 2016 rotation because there were zero nominated, big fat zero nominated. And a hashtag that was created by April Rain in 2015, the year prior, because someone was trying to touch her hair at the Oscars. She created hashtag Oscars So White. This particular hashtag got reborn and then got moved into a more of a cultural social movement realm in 2016, when there were zero Black actors and actresses nominated for any Oscars during that cycle. So hashtag So White became a hallmark of how are the Oscars now going to do with the racial strife of this organization that has so much elite individuals part of it, but yet there seems to be a cement ceiling for at least Black people. And then there was conversations about so many other non-white people who were not nominated as well, but had done excellent work. So as part of this work with these students, I winded up saying, well, let's talk about 2016. We wind up gathering some data. We'll talk about that in the slides coming up. But we wind up repeating this process in 2017, 2018. They since graduated, but I've continued to collect data each of the Oscars since they graduated. But each time we have an Oscars, at least in this particular work, there was a different hashtag that was part of a movement to move the predominance and the excellence of people who are non-white up to the forefront. So in 2017, it was hashtag Oscars Less White because of the nominees that were the actors that were nominated. And then in 2018, this was, if you don't recall, it was about the Me Too movement, which is all about supporting survivors of sexual assault, as well as Time's Up, which is supporting those individuals in making sure that they have advocates in order to move forward in their life. So in these 3 years of gathering data, it was difficult to do because there is, number one, trying to figure out which hashtags to use, and that beveled into what keywords to use. And of course, there's a lot of conversation about like, what is part of a tweet, what parts of a tweet do you care about, what parts you don't. If you've never done any type of tweet analysis, you have no idea how complex one tweet is, but essentially has 200 or so different columns or different features. So yes, every time you tweet something out, it is essentially 200 columns of information, from background to foreground to Twitter ID. It's a whole bunch of stuff is going on. So which of these columns do we isolate inside of our file? And then of course, how do we decide what is a Black tag or a keyword associated with Black Twitter, and then which ones do we kind of lay by the wayside. So what we wind up doing is using a combination of data tools and data skills in order to isolate the Black tags, which are listed here. In 2016, the host, when they actually had a host, was Chris Rock, and he's known to be very punchy and political inside of his rhetoric. So wanting to know if he was going to push the envelope inside of this very white space of the Oscars. And then in 2017, there was a lot of Black actors and actresses who were nominated. So would they win? What was going to be the comments about them online in real time? And then in 2018, there was a lot of conversation about Black Panther. And then, of course, Hidden Figures and some other very prominent movies of that time. Get Out was another very prominent movie in 2018. So trying to do our best as scholars to collect the hashtags and the keywords in order to now then scrape that data online. And so what we have here is the number of tweets that were associated with these tags. Now we collected data just in real time, and we had to do all of this Black tag and keyword filtering post post the event. So there's a lot of tweets that are still untouched by our process. But what wind up happening is that we had to do a lot of tackling of noise. So there are the language component, the natural language processing became this huge barrier for us, because we were seeing that even though we were using Python open source libraries, we still were having some issues identifying when Oscars referred to the ceremony that we were collecting data about versus an Oscar that was part of somebody else, like Oscar de la Hoya, if you're into boxing, or an Oscar that was part of a name of somebody else on Twitter. So we couldn't really disaggregate that as easily, so it took us some time. And then there was just understanding what was US based versus what was non-US based, and understanding different languages. So we had to parse all these things out, which really brought to the forefront of how much of our Python libraries are very much centered on English and US expression of English, expressions of English. And so it made it very difficult. There was other work that we wind up doing in order to disaggregate and make sure that we didn't conflate things. So what wind up happening is that we took a snapshot of how do we cover Black Twitter? What happens to be what we would consider inside of this Black Twitter sphere, and then what we considered not to be part of that sphere. So what you see on this slide with the Twitter bird is the 2016, 2017, and 2018 frequency of words when it came to our filtering of these tweets. On the far left is 2016. A lot of things about being awkward was definitely mentioned. 2017, because Viola Davis and Mahershala Ali won, there was a lot of things about winning, and of course, Best Actor award, and of course, Hidden Figures was definitely in very, very much tweeted at the time. And then, of course, 2018, it was all about Wakanda, Chadwick Boseman. Even though the movie had just come out and it wasn't actually nominated yet, there was so much buzz about that particular film and how it had kind of reached a global scale that it wind up getting a lot of attention during that time. And so let me get to what we found out. So you see all these tweets that we got, about 20 million or so each year. And then we decided to just go ahead and put it on a map. And we mapped the different hashtags that were the most prevalent within each year. So I'm showing Oscars of 2017 mainly because there were Black actors and actresses that were nominated, and of course, there was some winning going on as well. And so we try to put everything in one graph. That's the top left. And we only looked at a particular segment of time that is from about 9:30 till about 10:15 of what was the frequency of tweets about Oscars, the tweets about Oscars So White in particular, and then of course Hidden Figures and Moonlight. Both of those movies had received a lot of nods at the time. And as you can see, there's a lot of conversation about Oscars. This is us, of course, making sure we're talking about Oscars of 2017, not just any other Oscars from a different country or a different meaning. But at the bottom, there's all these like lines about Oscars So White, Hidden Figures, and Moonlight that we don't get to. We can't see. So we wind up zooming in on that and showing where we actually see people noting Oscars So White, Hidden Figures, and Moonlit. So, so what we see here is somewhere around 10 o'clock, we get like this spike in Hidden Figures. That's because there was an award that was on at the time. So you get like a little spike. And then you get another spike when it comes to, and you get another spike when it comes to Oscars So White, when it comes to about 10:15 as well. And this spike is only percentage of tweets. This is only about 5%, a little less than 5% of the tweets actually concern these two. So what we wind up concluding is that even though there was a lot of national attention to the lack of diversity in Hollywood, especially when it comes to the Oscars, what we don't have is a lot of online presence of it. And that presence is very much muted. So is it muted because there is not that many people talking about it? Like people weren't watching the Oscars, people weren't doing anything? Is it because there is gatekeeping happening, right? Like we as individual researchers could not get access to the data about the hashtag Oscars So White? Or is there something else going on? Is there certain suppression of certain hashtags because why have all of that content? Why have that particular language or that particular thought out in the ethos that's very prevalent? So we wind up leaving with more questions than answers, but we thought it was pretty interesting that given the percentage of Black people who are online via the Pew Research, that percentage didn't match the percentage of people who were actually doing any type of tweeting about the Oscars. And this happened in 2016 and in 2018. Very similar numbers, all hovering around this about 5% of the Oscar tweets that we found out. All right, so that is just hashtag activism, what we found out, first rung. But as I said, we had more questions than we had answers. We didn't understand what this mismatch was. And that has, moved this conversation into a different realm of understanding sentiment analysis. We now want to get into what is happening inside of these open source libraries that we're using on maybe why we weren't receiving the tweets that we were looking for. Maybe we're using the wrong hashtag, we're using the wrong keywords. What are we possibly not seeing, or what is innately as part of the system, how the system is designed, how the algorithms are designed, that is part of this compounding these issues as well. So we wind up settling on sentiment analysis, or neutrality in parentheses, mainly because you're going to see there's a lot of neutral language, quote unquote, that's happening. So we took the tweets that we have already separated as being in Black Twitter, and we separated them out into 4 different categories, and we focused on the first 2. Because we wanted to see a positive reflection of Blackness, and we also wanted to see what is kind of actions being done in order to push forward equity for Black people. So we looked at Black appreciation tweets as well as social justice tweets. The other two categories of trolling and satire, there's still a lot of work to be done. There's previous work and a lot of people working on adversarial attacks and satire within language that we still got to delve deep into, but it's something that's definitely on our radar to continue. So we wind up taking just the 2016 Oscar tweets, and then we separated them out into what is Black appreciation and social justice tweets, which is just this like sliver of 1%. So out of the 3 million that we wind up gathering in 2016, only about 21,000 of them we would say fall under this category of Black appreciation and social justice. So those are the tweets that I'm going to be talking about here on. And the reason why this is so important is because there is so many libraries that you can bring in that are already standardized and canned and used throughout many systems. And so I wanted just to kind of provide a little framing of which one of these sentiment analysis tools we wind up using. So it was the Natural Language Toolkit. That's that suite of libraries that's for English language and doing basically natural language processing and using statistics on that. Then we wind up downloading 2 other libraries. One happens to be the Vander lexicon, and then the other one happens to be Punkt. And this is all in a way in order to see what was the standards that in the 2018 timeframe of how do you now process these tweets? Because we want to know, we want to go from understanding what is just Black Twitter in general versus how are the tweets actually landing with these algorithms. And so now, the fun part, you get to see some tweets. I don't put who tweeted what, but I do put what the tweet was, and then I put what our initial analysis showed when it came to neutrality, positive or negative sentiment, and then of course the compound. And for all of you that are unfamiliar with this type of natural language processing routine, there is a presumption that everything that is sent to this natural language processor is neutral. And then there is a assessment of the tweet. So there's breaking the tweet into its words, and then from the words, understanding the root of those words, and then from each word, understanding whether or not it's a positive or negative and to what degree. And then you put those words all back together to then put together whether or not you have a positive sentiment or a negative sentiment, or you have neutral sentiment, which means it didn't show positive or negative according to the algorithm. And then the compound, this feature here, this compound is listed here at the bottom, and it is the sum of the positive, negative, and neutral scores, and then that's normalized between -1 and 1. So this is a whole lot of numbers that's happening on language. So here's the first example. It's a retweet at the Ellen Show that was really incredible at Chris Rock, #Oscars. Yet, when we put it through our natural language processor, we didn't make any type of adjustments. We just put it regularly through it. It was determined to be a neutral statement. I don't agree with that, but that's what it showed up with. And I have tons more of these, so I'm going to fly through them now, get you to some good ones. So here's another one. Civil rights leader and #Oscars So White protesters are now having a rally in the parking lot denouncing the lack of diversity. So somehow that has moved from from the neutral standpoint of 1.0 to now being something that's not listed as positive, but listed mostly as this about a quarter of this percent negative. So that means the compound is therefore negative. How is this a negative statement when it's just revealing a social issue or a social disagreement between two people? just raising the question. We can talk about it in a few. And so let me get to another one. Let me get to one that is kind of funny. So here is one where I I don't know how I got this. So this is someone who says a curse word and then says at Chris Rock, you a savage in that opening monologue, LOL, with a whole bunch of smiley faces. But yet, once again, you have a little bit of positive of about 18%. Negative is about double that at about 37%. And then the compound happens to be negative. This tweet to me was one that really exemplified here is this satire and these signatures of Black Twitter tweets that when you say savage, it doesn't is not a negative connotation inside of Black culture, but yet inside of this particular lexicon, it is listed as a negative connotation, which is one of the reasons why um, there is a more negative opinion given to this particular tweet and the move away from neutrality. So it's actually a positive tweet, but yet it is listed as a negative tweet by the algorithm. And I could actually go on for more and more. I know that we're running short on time and I want to leave enough time for questions. So what I'll do is I'm just going to show you these and you can just look at the neutrality, the positive, negative, and the compound. Just to look at it on your own and you determine whether or not you think this is a positive, a negative, or I don't know type of tweet. But just to understand the power of this particular set of Python libraries, these libraries are used everywhere in order to determine sentiment. So if these libraries are used everywhere and they are getting language, really not even language, context wrong, then what does that mean for everything downstream from this particular algorithmic evaluation? What does that say, right? So if you consider a statement neutral, but it's really not neutral, then so it's considered neutral, but it's really negative, then it's not flagged. And when it's coming to evaluating, let's say, content moderation, same thing can happen on the other side of the spectrum. If you have a particular statement that is listed as incendiary, it's listed as harassment, but it really isn't because the algorithm evaluation has said it is, then you have now inflicted harm about someone who is providing a particular stance without having any human to actually go back and go, wait a second, that's not really something that's incendiary. That's just a different way of speaking. That's just a different context that has not been taken into account when it comes to this this lexicon and of course the topologically and the linguistics of language. So as I said, I have plenty of these. Like I have 6 or 7 inside of here. A lot of them have to do with Chris Rock because he is a Black man who's a comic who talks about political issues, and he was the host of the show in 2016. So a lot of his tweets were kind of a mixed bag, which I found very interesting to see what would happen if you put them through this type of sentiment analysis. So what do we learn by all of these things? And of course, I have to put learn in quotation marks because I really do feel that these algorithms aren't learning anything. They're just repeating back what is embedded in the code. It's not actually learning anything at all. But this lean toward a neutral sentiment is something that I think does more harm than good because it's in an I don't know space, which is kind of a default. So I really feel the lack of action is also an action. So neutral doesn't provide you any value. There's no value add there. And so there's additional questions to be add is like, can we embed, or how can we embed cultural nuance inside of sentiment analysis techniques? And more appropriately, should we? um, and that's really the ethical quandary that is still being had even today, and I think will persist for years to come. So with that, I would like to say thank you. You're welcome to follow me on the Twitter, and of course there will be updates to the work moving forward at blacktwitterproject.org. So thank you very much, and I'm open for questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Marshall. I'm sitting here like just reveling in how intertwined this is, just to like the ways I use Twitter and think about it. We have a couple of questions that are already in the chat. So we can start with those. And I'll read them and just have you respond. That way everyone can hear what those questions are.
Perfect.
So we'll start with them all. Are you dealing with each tweet manually? And I know that further down you went on to clarify, I mean, besides the Python code, are you dealing with each tweet manually to make sure you analyze it correctly?
That's a great question. So at this time, we're not, because we're trying to do our best to see what is the limitation of the standard libraries that's being used. We're trying to see what is happening. What we did do, though, is in order to understand what are the tweets that we consider under Black Twitter, we did try to identify hashtags and Black tags to make it easier for us to identify those tweets. So we do go through a good portion of those manually in order to just double check, like, do we have the right mix there?
Okay. The next question is from Damien. Would you translate non-English tweets and use them in your data, or discard them if they were about related topics like the Oscars?
Yeah, so this is a very interesting question, and one I've been working with trying to figure out a great answer for. And here's the rub. There's not a great data set, I mean, a great linguistical lexicon for non-English. And it is a problem within the linguistics community. If you don't know Dr. Emily Bender, please look at her work. She literally, that's her question every time there is any type of language talked about inside of a paper. She goes, is this for English or is this for non-English, right? And I would love to actually include other languages, because the most common language is Spanish. And then I think the next comment is like Arabic. And so I would love to have those languages included as well, and to have this type of conversation and this type of evaluation algorithmically as well.
Okay, so I know that we have a couple of hands. We'll start with Christian. Go ahead.
Can you talk some more about the ethical implications of adding in, I guess, marginalized linguistics?
So the ethical quandary that I have, right, and I think a lot of people within the space is now having more robust conversations about, is language is part of certain cultures' identity. And so cultural competence, getting that context and putting it inside of a lexicon, is that something appropriate to do, right? Is there just some things that should not be digitized, is really the question.
Yeah.
And of course, there is this notion of language changes, especially within non-white communities. It changes all the time. And so is it important to have this cultural competence, and is it to be infused inside of a digital space where it's not handled by people of those communities, right? So mainly white people are now handling these handling these lexicons, but yet it's about non-white people. So that power dynamic is something to really think through a lot more deeply.
Yes, yeah, and that makes complete sense. But I wonder, okay, so like you're taking this up and raising these questions. So as more like non-white people like start taking up these issues and questions, does that change the ethics of that then?
It might. It really depends on how the data is interpreted. And is it based in understanding of scholars who understand the evolution of language? And that means you have to bring in people who are outside of computing. And we all know how wonderful that goes.
Yeah, it don't really work out.
Okay.
Yeah, I talk about computer scientists. Yep, I threw them shade. Yep, sure did.
I want to get to Christian Martinez's question.
Okay.
Because we have another raised hand there.
Go for it, Christian.
Okay, thank you. My question is related to those natural language processing libraries you referred to. When you discovered they weren't really accurate, did the team started building a new one with kind of increased awareness of the Black sentiment and the type of sentences that are written in Twitter?
Yeah, that's where I wanted to go. They graduated. Dang, they graduated. But that's something that I hope there can be a better, a bigger conversation around, because I don't think it's just one person like me doing it. I think it does need to be a community. I'm very much interdisciplinary and really feel like there needs to be social scientists at the table, humanities individuals at the table. There needs to be other types of hybrid computer scientists at the table in order to really see how do we move forward, right? Because my one thought, my one approach is the reason why, I'm bringing it up, but I don't want to be the only person working on it.
Thank you.
Yep, you're welcome.
Sorry, I didn't realize I was on mute. The next person I wanted to jump over to is Brandon.
Hello, thank you very much for your talk today.
Oh, you're welcome.
So you may have answered this already, so I'm sorry if I missed it, but did you run into situations where people tried to co-opt a hashtag, or sort of malicious actors who were trying to flood a hashtag with some sort of negative or some sort of offensive language meant to like throw off the discussion?
Oh, yeah. We did not run into that directly. And I think it's because we were individuals scraping that data in real time. So I think there was already algorithms in order to prevent those type of incendiary tweets in order to get through and then to be scraped. But to your point, there was already some co-opting of the Me Too hashtag, because it was a hashtag founded years ago by Tarvana, but then it happened to be kind of co-opted by several white women. And then it was kind of given back to Tarana Burke, given back to Tarana Burke. So that type of discourse had happened prior to the Oscars.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, but great question. I do wonder how much of the tweets we were unable to get that had that type of comments in them.
Yeah, because I feel like, whenever there's like a some sort of movement, the immediate reaction from the opposing group is to just like overwhelm or inundate the
Right.
movement with some of that harmful language.
Yeah, some of that hate speech, some of that, harassment and trolling, yes, and bots, yeah.
We have Dimithyu.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Thanks. Thanks for the talk. did you track the geographics of the tweets, like because it seems like geotag tweets are very limited. So do you have any plan to address that, like counting geographic locations?
Yeah, we actually, one of the students, so she was very into Plotly. And so she wound up doing a geotagging of a number of the tweets before we did the sentiment analysis. And that's how we actually found out how most of the tweets we had collected were outside the United States. When it came to the word Oscar, like the word Oscar just triggered a lot across the world. And so that's helped us scale back the tweets. But there's a kind of a complication when it comes to geotagging, because there is the geotag of the tweet, but there's also the location of the person. And sometimes they match and sometimes they don't. So we kind of ran into a, which one do we care about more? The location where they say they are, or the location that the tweet says it's coming from, right? So as someone maybe in Paris that is tweeting about the Oscars, so their geolocation says, Paris, but when you go to their Twitter profile, it says that they're based in, let's say, Atlanta. So which one do we care about?
All right, thanks. Okay.
Yep. Yeah, so just a little bit of an example of how that was a little more complicated question, which you might have thought.
I think we have time for one more question, so I'll go to Kun Lin.
Yeah. May I ask more than one more question? Because I have multiple here.
Let's see what we can fit in the last 5 minutes, but yeah.
Okay, all right. So let me pick the most important one. First is there are so many hashtags used in your data set, and when you are scraping the data from Twitter. So you mentioned the one issue, which is yes, you use the hashtag Oscar, but how did you know this is this Oscar ceremony, not other Oscars? Could you provide more information? How do you differentiate that from a data set? I guess it's not a manual work, it's too much work.
Yeah, so what happened is that which I didn't talk about, so thanks for asking the question, is that before each of the Oscars, we actually did a run through of what was the hashtags going to be used by the Oscars organizations. And so in 2016, they wind up just saying Oscars. In subsequent years, they've moved to just saying Oscars and then put the year at the end. And so we did a pre-processing of what would be the hashtags and what would be the keywords based upon the sentiment and the conversation happening online already, before we decided which were going to be the hashtags and the keywords that we were going to be scraping from.
I see. So may I still have a question? I have time. Let me ask one more question. Yeah, one more. So may I ask, like, why did you initially choose Oscar as the research target? If you are interested in the subculture, there may be some other more more intense social events regarding to this specific community. So why did you not choose others, but this entertainment ceremony?
Yeah, that's a great question. So entertainment is one of those that really push culture, and movies in particular tend to really push culture forward or backward, as well as far as the tropes and the stereotypes that are perpetuated through movies. And so I thought it was important, in order to look at the output source that is very much ubiquitous, which happens to be movies. And that is just, to me, the Oscars were the place to have this conversation. And given the timing in 2015, 2016, with the lack of people of color being nominated, or a little bit of people being nominated, it was important in order to have that as our central issue. There's definitely more polarizing social justice conversations to be had, but they all have some policies around them that are coming up and things like that. I wanted to really focus in on how do we change people's mindsets, and movies is one of those ways that change people's mindsets.
All right, got it. So I will stop here, even though I still have some other questions. So, but yeah, thank you so much.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
I want to thank you so much, Dr. Marshall, for a really great conversation. These have been some really engaging questions that we've had. And so I hope folks have taken some things away from it. I think you've put up contact information or ways that people can follow your
Yep.
work or reach out to you if they have future questions about the stuff that you're doing. So yeah, thank you all for tuning in today. I will see you all next week, where Dr. Amanda Lazar will